that will be sung will be, Can He Depend on You? Can He Depend on You? Benjamin will lead us in that song in just a moment. All right? And after he leads that song, Michael, will you lead us in prayer after that? And then we'll begin class. Okay? I know it's just a few minutes to get started, but it isn't going to hurt us. We got plenty of stuff to cover, some good territory, as we're getting ready to put it all together. By next week, as I said before, all of it should be practical, but as I mentioned, next week, I want to give us the tools. I want to talk about how we would implement the things that we need to do. We're covering the ground of necessity. As we talked about last week, we spent a great deal of time in the letter to the Ephesians in chapter 4 because it's an imperative that we must do it, and we must have persons that are willing to help others to do it, to lead them in that. And a church, as we mentioned last week, cannot thrive, will not grow, and in fact will die if we're not. And as you noticed on our Sunday morning lesson, I'm dealing with leadership, elders, shepherds in general, but these principles will apply to us, and we'll continue that. Likewise, the bulletin this week will be another addition to the work of the church. We're going to talk about what we're going to deal with today. So I'll have a brief article on that subject, and hopefully that will help us. And by next week, as we wrap things up, I'm going to give you things that you can do with me, with one another, for yourself. If we put these things to practice, then I believe that we will do well, all right? We'll thrive. But I want you to consider those things. All right, well, let's go ahead and begin with the song and then a prayer.
Number 586, Can He Depend on You?
Jesus the Savior came down from above, and to bring mercy and love. Crucify Him, the mob scornfully cried, so He on Calvary died. While on the cross He prayed, Father, forgive, for they know not what they do. For us He died that for Him we might live. Can He depend
first of all, for the love that you had for us, the willingness to send your son, his obedience and love for us, that he willingly gave his life for us on the cross for our sins. We pray that we always put that first in our minds and our hearts every day. Father, we're mindful of those of our members who have been sick. We put your healing hand upon them. We're thankful for that. We do have others that are dealing with physical problems, and if you will heal them, and if they're not, then take them home in there. We know, Father, as we continue to study your word, and we pray that we'll have an open mind and open heart to try to understand, not only for ourselves, but for where we can teach other people about the lost condition that they're in. We pray we have the desire to do that, and not just keep it to ourselves. We do fall short of this, my Father. Pray you'll forgive us of our sins, help us to be better in the Lord, the path. We pray for our young people, the world that they live in is a hard place. We pray for guidance for them. We pray for strength for them, that the Lord will just be for their interest. We pray that we'll be examples to them, not cause them to make them stumble. We pray for older people here, and they deal with physical problems. We pray that you should give them the strength that they can continue to come out and be with us. So thankful for each and every one that does come here to this congregation. We pray now as we go through this lesson, and we'll listen, and we'll try to understand and apply it to our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Just like the song that we sang last week, I Want to Be a Worker for the Lord, this one too is a challenging song. Challenging song because of application, because he's asked the question. The songwriter has made a very good point here. Can Jesus depend on us? Can he depend on you? Do I really want to be a worker for the Lord? This is not just a matter of, again, going through some things that he must or we must do or required to do, but it's the ideal that we understand that there is something that God wants from us, commitment that is wholehearted and expected, and I've got to decide whether I want or I will do it or not. And sometimes I may, and sometimes I may not. But the key is, I must remember that I've got to strive to be a worker that he can depend upon. It needs to be shaped and formed in my life, and I've got to strive for that. So our objective this week, I'm going to ask a question of you, and this will form the foundation of our study. Are you a disciple? Think about that for the moment. Before I ask anybody that, I want to ask you what the disciple word means. What does it mean to be a disciple? Okay, a studier of, a follower of, right? In its very strictest sense, it's a learner, right? And we understand that the learner in the context of the Bible, particularly with the Hebrew culture, was one who followed. Those who followed Jesus were learners. They were called to be disciples. Likewise, in the Jewish tradition for the law, men like Gamaliel were teachers of the law, and they had students or pupils that learned. Scholars say that somewhere around the age of 14, 15, maybe even as early as 13, if someone was set upon learning the law especially, in other words, beyond what we would call traditional education, the primary education. Now, we go to, say, high school, 17, 18 or so. Well, a Jewish person, male and female, both would be educated to the age of 12. That was the primary education. It was very equivalent, and it was a lot equivalent to ours in the sense that a person learned the very fundamentals of their language, their practices. They would learn their grammar lessons, if you will, but they also learned the Scriptures, and they learned them very well. They could recite them. In fact, I've got a quotation from Josephus, but also from some others in the bulletin in that respect. All right, a disciple is a learner and a follower. We'll develop that thought a little more. Now let me ask the question once more. Clay, are you a disciple? Okay. All right, so remember the definition, right? Not only is it one that's a learner, but is one who is a follower. Okay, we're going to get a little bit deeper into the discussion of what a follower is. Because we may be thinking on one level we indeed are a follower. But if we re-examine it based upon Jesus' teaching about a follower, we might discover we're not. Now again, this is something that I have to learn as well as you. Do not be mistaken, just because I've chosen a profession that also gets me involved in the Word of God and the teaching, that automatically qualifies me, so therefore I don't have to concern myself. That's not what we're going to learn. Just because somebody's preaching does not mean they're a follower. Now hopefully they are, but that doesn't mean that they are. So keep that in mind as I ask that question. All right, Justin, are you a follower? Okay, so Justin and Clay, I'm picking on you two young men, but I could ask others, I could ask that of myself. Am I a follower? A follower is a learner. There's several different levels of that. Certainly you're going to do it formally like we're doing here in this auditorium this evening. On the Lord's Day, we set aside time for Bible study. Wednesday, likewise, right? That's one ideal or example of learning. There is hopefully daily reading and meditation. I'll have to admit, again, in my life, there were days in my past I didn't open that book up. I didn't read that book, but I went to church. I might have read it once or twice in that week, and you know what? Probably did it on Sunday and Wednesday. I didn't open that book Monday. I didn't open that book on Tuesday. Didn't open that book on Thursday or Friday. Didn't open it up all day Wednesday. And if I just happened, because out of necessity or out of habit or fear of being in trouble, if I didn't, I did in the Bible class on Wednesday. I opened it up. That book was about as dusty as it could ever get. Now, go back to my original question, am I a follower? Was I a follower in those moments, in those days, in those times? That's just talking of the reading and the meditation. Yeah, I claimed to be, didn't I? Maybe I wasn't even asking myself that question. Like Joe said, I can claim to be, but I might not be as, let's say, as arrogant as that, but I can be arrogant enough to just dismiss it altogether. Don't even think about it. All right? Still a pretender, right? Okay, that is important for me to understand. That's a starting point, as we're going to see this evening. That there is much more involved in being a disciple because I have to take what I read and do something about it. Are there things in your life you can read and you have nothing to do about it? In other words, you can't put anything to practice or work. Is that true? I love history. Tell you what, I'll devour it. I read it, I can watch it and everything. But there ain't anything I can do about that. It's interesting. It can help me in some of my studies or applications if it involves Christians or religion or other issues that would be applicable to biblical stories. There's a great deal I would know about the period in which the Europeans were fighting over whether or not they kept Catholicism and the various degrees of it, and that's long before the Reformation period. It's interesting, and that can be helpful. But aside from that, there's so much that I know or I love and I learn from American and world history that I don't do anything about. Okay, that's well and good. I don't want to spend all of my time on that. That can be a challenge or a problem. But you learn that there are things that you study that are calls to action, calls to work. And I don't know that we always appreciate that. I'll be quite frank with you. I go back to this, and I'll beat this drum, no matter how much it seems so repetitive, it is necessary. That I get some things done in regards to my salvation, and I'm done. Maybe not saying that, but I have decided I'm done because I don't do anything else. Have you ever known anybody personally that once they were baptized into Christ, and we're going to just have to assume that their heart was completely, at that moment, convinced and devoted to their need for salvation? That's all we can do, right? Have you known anybody who has done that and did nothing more? I have. Let's be honest.
When you first came, that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an example. right? And sometimes we know that we do that too. I'm not saying that, especially if we had grew up, as we would say, in the church. I hesitate to use that language, but you know what I'm talking about. To grow up in the family and the relations and being able to, or be here for worship and study, maybe there'll be a little bit more interest and maybe more or less because of our knowledge. We say, okay, we can do certain things, but that can also be very feigned. That can be very easy and perfunctory and may appear to look like real righteousness, discipleship, but isn't indeed. But you know, you can get fervor, as many of us might in our youth, and we're ready to go. But as the preacher sometimes says, month passes, 6 months passes, the year passes, and things change, sometimes very rapidly. To where if you were to come in and meet that person a year after they obeyed the gospel, but had not known them before, they may not look anything like what those folks saw and that person saw in themselves a year prior. Okay? It's more than just the temperature dropping, so to speak, the passions allaying, that you become less effective. Although that can be in part of it, it's you have lost sight of what being a Christian is. Because is there a difference between being called a Christian and a disciple? Sarah? Is there a difference? No. It's just perspective, isn't it? Disciple, as Brother David pointed out, is the ideal of one who is a student, one who learns, and one who follows. Particularly in the Jewish tradition is the picture that's painted for us. In our modern education system, we think of education in terms of going to some institution and gathering the knowledge and then leaving that place, right? And maybe not even having connections or anything like that, okay? But in the Jewish tradition, you spent a great deal more time with the person, and you did it more than just, say, 6 hours or 8 hours a day. You did it 24/7 for the 10 years or so. I didn't mention that a while ago, but for instance, Paul, if it was about 13 to 15 or somewhere around there, some will suggest maybe as late as your 15th year, you would go to that person, and that person would now not only be your tutor, but you would be with them night and day until about the 25th year. Anybody want to go to college for 10 years? And then guess what? You don't go home. Well, I'm not saying he never went to see family, but you know what I mean. He stayed there with Gamaliel as an example, right? And that's the way they did things. That's the education, because it developed him in the skill sets and the abilities that he was being trained for, particularly as one who would be a famous lawyer in the law, would be able to judge these matters. And it was very important to the Jews because their law was everything. And you know what? They weren't wrong in that. And the point was, even though they abused it and they misapplied it, they were right in this much, that the law held and contained everything for life. And they would say that much. So it wasn't a bad thing, as long as you learned it well and was able to apply it well. But we think of education in that sense. I go away to school for, if I'm not living at home and going to primary school, I go away to college for 3 years, 4 years, 2 years, 4 years, what have you, and I'm always coming back, and then when I'm done, then I go out and I do these things. Well, in one sense it is true that in the Hebrew tradition you would go out and do, but would still be in context to the law. What we're learning about discipleship in Christianity is that when we are done, as it were, we're never done. It is the picture of being a follower, as we will see, of Jesus and never leaving His side. No 10 years, no, lifetime. Okay? You're at lifetime at His feet, at lifetime at His home, as it were. A lifetime in His presence, a lifetime in His Word, and then, of course, a lifetime of the application of His Word. Because the unique thing about the discipleship of Christ is that from the very onset, once we have become a disciple, we will be equipped for at least some things to do. And His intention is for us to continue to grow in that. So the word Christian is, again, synonymous only, but it gives us a different perspective, right? It's the ideal of one is of Christ. But you see, the disciple is one who is following and as a teacher, as a student, always at the feet of Jesus. Okay? So when we think about these terms, we've got to remember. Matthew the 28th chapter, verses 18 through 20. Can anybody quote that without looking it up? From whatever translation you use, doesn't matter. That's one of those really important ones. And I'm not saying you have to be able to remember, but you certainly need to know. When the Great Commission, as it's called, Jesus will tell His disciples, this is prior to His ascension, go you into all the world, or if you're looking at the King James, go ye, go you into all the world, and I'll be quoting primarily from the New King James, go you into all the world and preach the gospel. That's verse 18. And make, verse 19, disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age or world, whichever one is being used in that context. Make disciples, verse 19. All right, that'll form a foundation principle. It is a great commission that was given to the disciples, but would that also, by extension, apply to us? Is there anything in the text that teaches me that, or is it just their duty? What about verse 20? Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I command you. Now, do not misunderstand what he's saying. He's not saying, as the apostles, you got to get on your sandals, get out your house, and get out on the road and spend your life going into all the world. That's not the point. Sometimes we really don't appreciate these things. We're not under obligation. No man, no particular one. I enjoy working with the brethren in India. I've developed relationships with them, particularly my translator. I mentioned before, if I ever lose my translator, it will not make any sense for me to go there. I don't care. Go into all the world won't apply because I cannot communicate, not well enough to convey. There are folks that I could talk to and study, do not get me wrong, but as a whole, there's nobody of the Lord's people that I'd be able to help because I have nobody who could translate the things that I need to teach. They might be able to give some fundamentals, but, you know, they can do that themselves. I'm confident that the brethren that I work with can teach someone what they need to do to be saved without me. There are other things that they need more help in and will grow and mature in, but that's going to require translators. Somebody can speak the language that I speak and convey that in the language they speak. Even if I cared to, and I'm not saying I would never want to, but I don't think it would ever be possible, their language would be much too difficult for me. It's not like trying to learn Spanish. And I don't even know that. The language is complicated. Again, the command isn't to go there. The command is to go and teach. When he says to teach them to observe all things whatsoever I command you, what he is saying is they take the good news that they have learned from you and they apply it in their lives and they teach others. In fact, that's what we see when we get to the end of the story, so to speak. You will discover that Paul will tell Timothy that, to teach other men to be teachers in the last letter that he writes. As we will see also in Acts chapter 8, they will apply their learning from the apostles, and they will do the same thing the apostles. They didn't all just travel everywhere like Paul did, or maybe even Peter. They usually, or typically, went back to where they came from, and that was the idea. When they went back to their homes, then they would teach where they lived. And many others would. So your expectation and mine is this. We're all to be learning and then teaching what we have learned where we are or wherever we may be. Whether it be that we get up and go someplace or we stay here, it matters not. What we are to do is to teach. All right? So you see, by extension, a disciple has no choice. And a disciple who is, as we also call a Christian, is to be of Christ. That means you are owned by Him. You become the slave of, if you will, the Master Jesus. Leaves you no choice. Because let's look at it in its plain and simple language. If you indeed were a slave of another, do you get to choose what you will do? Do you choose where you will go? No. You serve that person, right? There's no misunderstanding that. If we were talking in a story of a slave, they would have no choice, okay? What we learn of voluntary slavery, as we read in our New Testaments, and one that is, enriching. This is a slavery that's nothing like man could ever imagine. This is a slavery which will give you blessings beyond your own understanding, beyond your own comprehension. And it means that He will give you blessings not only in this life, but the one to come. Okay? And the reward is great. All right, so a disciple is a Christian. Are you a disciple? As I asked Clay, as I asked Justin, as I've asked myself. And I might discover by the end of the lesson that sometimes I'm lying to myself. Maybe too many times I'm lying to myself. And I don't even have to speak to myself to do that. I just simply by action am lying. I'm a pretender because I'm trying to look the part. I appear to be, maybe even in some eyes. Like I said before, remember what I said. Maybe I can get in the pulpit and speak eloquent enough. Probably not, but let's assume that I can. And I can repeat that week after week. In your eyes, I may look just like a disciple, right? I don't speak lies, I speak the truth. You hear the lessons. Maybe even they're pretty good. Maybe they actually have a little meat behind them and you say, wow, that's more than just the bare bones truth. It's the meat as well on the bone. Well, that's good. But again, if I'm not applying that, if I'm not living that, then far as I'm concerned, it has no help. It doesn't mean anything. I'm not a disciple, at least from the Lord's perspective, regardless of what you may see or not see. And the same may be said of you. We've got to be careful. That's why when we observe the work, as we're going to continue the theme, we observe our work here. Now think about this from this perspective. Let's assume, just as I was some months ago, brand new to you. You walked into this assembly for the first time. Now obviously you can only know so much from that, but you can learn a great deal. And you've done that, I'm sure, if you've traveled and went to a foreign place or a place you've never been before. Can you form a perception, maybe even a realistic one, of what you think may be the case there? You know, what they are doing and what they're not doing, you can get an idea whether these people may be workers or not. That doesn't mean you don't know everything. That doesn't mean that you're going to be able to settle that matter. But as far as you can see in their worship, you may get a picture of that. And if you spend any time with them and you see their work or interaction together, whatever that may be or whatever it may not be, you get a bigger picture and a more clearer understanding of what you're dealing with. And I'm going to be just quite blunt and not about being negative or ugly, but you know, I have chosen to go to a workplace that I knew before I ever got there. This is a serious no working place and I've got to see what I can do to help. Not because I'm special, because I'm a worker. It's like, man, they need a supercharged guy. And I don't know if I'm even up to that task. Because I have already observed, if I were not going to work with them, so whatever reason I chose to do that, be it wise or unwise, if I were not a preacher, I would not worship there. Isn't that scary? Not because they're wrong, or because they're doing wrong things, or they're, apostate as far as the church is concerned. It's just they're of this class. They're not working, and they claim to be disciples, but they're not. Now, that's a strong indictment, isn't it? That's why I said it's very blunt. But it is something that we need to consider. Now, of course, people make poor decisions about where to worship based upon superficial temporal things. Now, I want to be careful about the temporal and superficial because you may still be in these environments, but your reason and purposes are different. But we also know that some people in our culture, or a lot of people, and that's probably true with a lot of cultures, we gravitate to the areas or places to worship that satisfy our own social needs. We're a young family, right? Well, we go to a congregation and a bunch of old folks there, as we're going to say. You're probably not going to worship there if you have a choice, right? You may go someplace else. You maybe because we're privileged can drive further and you'll go to a place where you see the young peoples or you see the people with little children or, your children your age. My father gave us a choice when we came out of institutionalism when we were high school age. Me and my siblings were all close together and we're all high school, first year junior high. So There were two congregations within reasonable driving distance. My father preferred and liked the other congregation, where actually we had learned to come out of what we did. The other, we preferred as the kids. Why? Guess what? There weren't a bunch of little kids there, but there was a slew of teenagers there, male and female. So, there you have it. You see, I'm not saying that it was completely bad. In fact, it was it was a fairly good place. In fact, that's where I met Jeannie and got married eventually. But you see the kinds of reasonings we can have? It's not that these are completely wrong, but we may need to check ourselves to find out, are we striving to be disciples? That's why I'm asking that. Not because I'm trying to nitpick people's judgment, because it's your judgment, that's for sure. But we need to be asking ourselves, do we go there because it is very comfortable to us socially, or comfortable for us in some other temporal way? You know, we feel, okay, maybe, and this happens too, and it happens whether we're old or young sometimes, maybe we don't feel like the preacher, you know, he does well and he does just what I want, and it's just kind of calm and everything's just going along and no waves. Not that we're looking for trouble, that's not my point. But everybody are like a bump on the log. They're just there. And that's comfortable to people, right? You like routines. You get to a certain age, you don't want to break those routines. I want my coffee at a certain time. I want my breakfast at a certain time. I want my preacher at a certain time. And I want him to only speak this way. And I don't want it to get too heavy into the doctrine. And I don't want to, you know, spend most of your time talking about those other folks, whomever they are, all right? Talk about these big sins that I know that I'm not participating in and I probably never ever would, all right? Let's talk about murderers, adulterers, and sodomites, and you know what I'm saying. Let's get the rich Bible stories on that. Let's do some cute stories for the kids if we have any. And there's what we have. That's what I like. So sometimes it's not me just looking for my kids or myself to find companions and friendships my age. Sometimes we just like comfortable things, right? We just like this. Everything's just all right. And I always want to be careful too, because besides that, we can also get the impression, because we don't strive with one another, or we don't have contentions or issues or discussions with one another, that we're all right. Now, I'm not arguing for chaos. I'm not even arguing for trouble. That's not the issue. But the sign that those things aren't there isn't always the sign of peace. Sometimes that's a sign of lazy. That's a sign of Laodiceanism. That's a sign of you don't really care. You know, there wouldn't be no trouble anyway, because even if somebody did differ with you, you ain't going to make no issue because it doesn't really matter to you. Again, you understand what I'm saying. I'm not arguing that we need trouble for everything to look right, because you don't want a lot of that. But you do want to make sure that you're alive. You ever checked somebody's pulse, Bob, and they weren't alive? Or it was so faint you made you wonder. My mother had some faint pulse, and some of them, like I supposedly do some, and Jeannie is kind of deep, and you know, it can be kind of light, and that can be kind of scary if somebody's not feeling well, right? You don't want to be that person, do you? Because that's probably not a good sign. And you certainly don't, if you are a person that is alive, as far as spiritually speaking, you don't want to find people dead like that, right? Or near death, or at least possibly dead, correct? Okay, that's what we're dealing with here. Matthew 22, verse 37. Matthew 22, verse 37. It's always interesting to go to gospel meetings. Hadn't been in a long time till this year here, so I come down to Florida. But the fellow that was preaching over in Brandon, he had a neat practice. I'll tell you what, you weren't going to forget his verse. You might forget mine, but he would repeat that maybe 6 times and give you plenty of time to stop hearing those pages ruffle. And he would say this, and he'd just keep repeating the same verse. And by the time he was ready to read, you have no excuse to have your Bible open. Matthew 22, verse 37. Joe, would you read that for us, please?
Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind.
Wow. You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, all your heart, and your mind, right? All of you. That's really what we need to get out of it. Of course, he delineates what he's dealing with here, but it's all of you. Now, when we talk about loving the Lord our God with all of us, all of who we are, the essence of who we are, we got to understand that it's not a feely thing. It's not an emotion, and it may involve emotion, but it's not founded in emotion. Okay, it's not superficial either. It's a dedication. So remember my original question to Justin and Clay, or even to myself, am I a disciple? Oh yeah, I love the Lord. Okay, what have you done this week in that respect? What have you done spiritually this week? Well, maybe you've read, and that's good. I'm talking about outside coming to the assembly. Maybe you read, and that's good. Maybe you've done some studying, that's good. And you're praying. What else? Let's just ask ourselves, what have we done this week aside from that? And hopefully we are doing that. You see? All right. Now, if someone did not know us, other than being a decent person, if they, observed we didn't look like we were a danger or harm to them or some crazy or whatever, would they know that I'm a Christian? But I got one better than that. Would they discover, as the New Testament teaches us, that I'm a disciple of Christ? Because we've learned in the first century church at the beginning, there was no mistake. These people are those Christ peoples. These people are of that way. They even say they're of the way. There wasn't no confusion. It wasn't like, well, they're denominational, but they have these certain things that are similar. No, they were of the way, and people knew that. Okay, they could be identified quickly and readily. So I have to ask myself, can I be identified? Somebody knows that I'm religious, that's good, I suppose. At least we know we're not real in bad shape. Somebody knows that I'm a Christian, and we'll use the term generically. Doesn't matter what they believe about what my faith is, etc., but they get the impression that I'm someone who believes in Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's the point. All right. Maybe somebody also observes and they know me to be at least relatively moral, right? I don't go out and steal from them and other folks, etc. And I live a fairly quiet life, and that's a good thing too. Don't get me wrong. What else do they know about me? Is that it? If that's it, guess what? Then I'm not a disciple. I know it sounds scary. I know it sounds, we're going to have to come face to face with that, and it's not going to be a pretty picture if I'm looking in that mirror. And I have to admit, I've looked in that mirror, and it's not pretty at all. I'm not a disciple. I'm not a disciple. Because somebody has to be able to know. It's not going to be an accident. You can't just say, well, I really am a disciple. They just don't know it. No. According to the New Testament, they're going to know it. They're going to know that you are a disciple. They're going to know that you're of the way. Let's turn over to Acts, the 17th chapter. Now, I know we're using Paul, the apostle, as an illustration, but really we could do this and many others. But it just so happens the history book follows him, right? But I just want us to notice one thing, very important, okay, for us to see. In verse 16, we learn that Paul is provoked as he sees and observes what's going on in the city. Now, that would be a start of a lesson. Are you provoked when you see wickedness? And you know what hopefully you understand what we're talking about. He is stirred up is the ideal. There's a stirring within him that says, this is not right, this is terrible, it's going to cause them to be lost completely if you continue to teach this and they continue to follow this path. This is going to just destroy everyone, including the very young. They're going to grow up in that culture. He was stirred up. Okay? And so he was reasoning in the synagogue, which is like Paul. And there were God-fearing Gentiles there, right? But where else? Look at the end of verse 17. Where else did Paul work? In marketplace. All right. That's where everything was going on. That's where the happenings were outside of religion. Okay? Now, I don't know what that would look like for us. You know that I'm not trying to sit here and tell you we got to go to some grand bazaar and just start standing there and speaking, or lunch hour downtown Lakeland. You certainly wouldn't want to do it at the interstate, I suppose. But, and just start screaming at the top of our lungs, some gospel lesson, right? So everybody can hear us. That's not necessarily the case. Traditional would hold that this is a place where things were said and told, even in respect to religion, and maybe even mostly into that, but other things. Philosophy would be included. Paul went to the synagogues. We know that. And yes, the synagogues also, which was kind of nice, would have Greeks that would come in and want to hear about God, want to hear the Word of God. And they would hear these rabbis on a regular basis, these teachers of the law. But now Paul's coming along, and he's got something much more precious and different than what they're giving. It is similar because it's related to that, but by extension, it's even greater because it's a salvation story that's saying, I can get out of this mess. I can be better than what I once was. But what is the synagogue? The equivalent of? Yeah, that's it. It's equivalent of church. If I ever wanted a pattern for the church, now, there's nothing wrong with us having daily services of sorts here, and some people come and some go, that would be great if people would come in off the street and come and study. I'd just love to set up class right here. It'd be convenient, wouldn't it? That's not likely to happen. But with them in those days, them going into the synagogue on a daily basis was a very common thing. So he's going to utilize that. But never forget that that is a religious setting. There will be trouble there, but he does have people that he can reason with a little bit better, and a lot of times that goes better for him. But now, Paul is also willing to go out into the street, so to speak. He's waiting on Timothy to come to town. He's hanging out in Athens. He's already left Thessalonica under duress because things were going bad. But now, because he teaches in Athens in the marketplace, what opportunity arises? What opportunity arises? Verse 18. Philip, read that for us.
Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him and some said, what does this babbler want to say? Others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection.
Okay, so here's what happens. Now we use the word, you got the babbler. Sometimes we see that. It is negative in one way, but what it is telling us, and that's what the original we would understand in the original, the Greek, is that he's speaking things that we don't understand, not because we don't understand the words he's saying, but the words are foreign in application. That's why he's called a babbler. We've never heard this talk before. You know, if you can imagine, you can understand the language, but whatever the person's talking about, you never heard of before in your life, not even remotely. That's how they described him. But here's the deal. He says he's talking of strange things, and they know that he's talking of religion. He's talking of God, of a God of sorts, right? We know he's talking of the God, but you know what I mean. Let's call him up there. We need to hear him more. The marketplace would have been a more noisy environment. It certainly wouldn't have lended for any of the things they might have imagined in getting a little more detail. But you see what it afforded him. The position that he was in, and this is something for us to go forward in our thinking about what we would or could do in order to do this work that we're called to. All right? So Paul utilized this marketplace because once he's done teaching in the synagogue, and you don't want to just sit around waiting, he's not twiddling his thumbs, waiting for Timothy to show up. Apparently there's no need for him to be a tent making, to make a living, to feed himself. So he's going to do the work of the Lord. And he's teaching. He's in the proper place. He's in a place where people can do this sort of thing. And people will listen. He's not just shouting to a bunch of loud people. There is a lot of noise there. But he's actually speaking to people. And these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers come along. They're the college of Athens of the day. And their colleges are religious. So, hey, what's he saying? What's this babbler speaking of? He's talking about he's talking about, I think, some strange or foreign deities. Let's get him up there. So that's what you see in the next verse. Okay? So they took him, verse 19, and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is which you're proclaiming. Oh, wouldn't that be a wonderful? That somebody asked me, I want to hear what this new teaching is. Let us hear this new things that you're saying. Wouldn't that be wonderful? How did he get there? It didn't happen immediately. It didn't happen just because Paul's Paul, right? It didn't even happen because he was in the synagogue. Because if he'd have stayed in the synagogue, and I'm not even saying that he couldn't have, But the point is that he wasn't in the synagogue. If he'd have been in the synagogue, he probably wouldn't even have had an opportunity with these folks, these Areopagites. But because he's in the marketplace, they're curious and say, let's get him up there. I want to hear what he has to say that's new. Now, we know the rest of the story. Our point and our purpose of learning that is to know that there are tools. The book of Acts tells us how we're going to evangelize, as an example, how we're going to live this disciples' life. Now, not every specific particular, not that we will do it exactly like a blueprint, as I said before. Oh, by the way, there are places in the world in which way that Paul did it, the exact way, could be performed. I've been to places similar to this. Maybe not exactly like that, but very close. In India, there are places where that would be very appropriate and very likely to speak in some public, bizarre forum or area that's public. They'll set these tents up and they will use the PA systems and they will broadcast, and they will do that in villages. Instead of door knocking, as we might imagine, they would actually go to the villages and do that, and it's very effective. Gets people's attention. They want to know about this strange God. Now, I don't say strange in the sense that they have no clue about Christianity. There's plenty of it where we work, but there is some curiosity there. Maybe they've been thinking about things. Not that they come out in masses, but they might have a baptism or two out of a village in 1 year because of at least that on occasions on Saturdays. But we're getting an ideal, right? Though it's exactly what he did, we may find ways within the context of that to develop our work as well. Matthew 6:24, what does the statement teach? Now that one we should have it memorized. Anybody have it memorized? Matthew 6, verse 24. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. Now you're 33, right? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all the rest of these things shall be added unto you. 24, he talks about what? Yeah. You have two masters. How well are you going to do? You can't. Right. It's impossible. What he's saying is he's setting up, I don't know how you say it in rhetorical construction, but it's an impossibility. It's an absurdity is the question. When he says you'll love one and you'll hate the other, he's presenting something that nobody would even consider because it won't work at all. You can't even start off. You're right. If you did it all, there would be no love for both. There's no way you can balance that act. But they wouldn't even start there. So that's the issue. With Jesus, there's no option. You can't have to. You pretend that you have to, but you can't have to, and it'll never work. No more, and this is where it does parallel fairly easily, no more than it would work in our day. If we had two masters, and they both vied for our attention and our labors, there's going to be conflict, right? Even if you could come up with some solution for a time, there's going to be a conflict, isn't there? But with Jesus, it's always a conflict. You cannot serve two masters. It's Matthew 6:24. You're going to either love the one and hate the other or vice versa, right? It's always going to be that way. So a disciple. We've got 4 things that I want us to see about discipleship. Let's start with the first one. Let's go to John chapter 12, verse 28. John chapter 12, verse 28. Sister Jordan, would you read John 12, 28? All right. Wow. So we can see the construction of Jesus is saying, Father, glorify your name. And He does, doesn't He? And He will do it again. You see, within the context of Jesus the Son and the Father, we see that servant spirit, don't we? Was Jesus a servant? We might even argue, if we're going to use the literal definition of doulos, and He's a slave, because we some have tiers, of course. A servant isn't necessarily a slave in modern parlance, but at any rate, was Jesus a slave? Yeah. Yeah, even to His own Father. Wow. The Son of God, who's God in the flesh. Though He's in the flesh, He's God. He's a slave of His own Father. That's what it says, right? Okay, what about chapter 15? John 15, verse 8. John 15, verse 8. Brother Miller, you want to read it, or can you?
By this my Father is glorified, that
Okay. So, you got to understand, Jesus, we know He's talking to His disciples who would become apostles. And He talks about first in chapter 12, Him glorifying His Father and obviously His relationship. Then He turns around and He talks about it in respect to His disciples. They've got to be disciples in every way, don't they? But you know that lesson's for us as well. The word glorify, magnify, maybe your translation uses those other words. It's the idea of praise. It's about lifting up. That's what we're called to do. And you know what's interesting? When we say glorify, here's the traditional denominational ideology or theology of glorify. You got your hands raised, you're singing praise and hallelujahs, etc. Now, I'm not arguing about sincerity of heart. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody because I'm not going to even say that they're not sincere in doing that. But is that the Bible illustration of glorifying? Is that what he says about it? No. Our work, our discipleship, our activity, by our fruits we will be known. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15 and 16, when he talks about fruit bearing, bad tree, good tree, you know the fruits, right? It's by our work. And therefore, that is what either glorifies or if we're not, doesn't glorify God at all. So, it's feigned. Well, you know, the Israelites did that too often. And we can too. We go through the motions of praise and glory. That's why I tell us, I'm telling us, I'm not telling you, I'm telling us, we better be very careful about living out the songs that we sing. I'm not arguing stop singing, because if you continue with thinking of what I'm thinking right now, and if you're not a disciple, you may stop singing because you start singing some of these songs, they're indicting me. They're telling me, I'm the one. Like we sing, I'm the one. Am I a worker for the Lord? I'm lying. I'm not a worker for the Lord. Oh, can He depend on me? No, He couldn't depend on me. I'd be the last one to go out there. Right? You see? And so on and on. And it can be involving moral issues, of course, but we're dealing with, of course, the singing of songs that talk about my service and my work and my devotion, my adoration and my glory. So in the song that I sing these praises, you know, we say they don't go any higher than the ceiling if they're not true, but it's scarier than that. It's not only that you don't hear it, but we are lying ourselves into condemnation. We're lying to ourselves all the way to the grave and, of course, eventually to eternal condemnation. All right, honoring God. Secondly, we've got to learn from God. Let's go over to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. Now, the occasion in John chapter 8, you remember, he starts in John 8 with these Pharisees who just determined they've got Jesus now. They think they've got Him in a bind because they bring this adulterous woman and throw her basically at Jesus. He's on the ground, and we know that he's writing something we don't know, and a lot of discussion over that. But the point is they think they've got Him because if He says, stone her, because that's what they think He should do because the law would teach that, then he's going against Roman law and he's going to have to answer to the governor, and they can go to the governor and get him in trouble. If he says don't, then he's proved that he doesn't really agree with the law. And so he cannot be who he says he is, let alone a prophet, because he's denouncing the Word of God. But there's a real big problem in that.
They bring an imperfect situation to him because they weren't following the law to begin with.
That's true in the story. But there was another fundamental technical thing also. He didn't even have to answer why. They brought one. The law, yeah. Well, the imperfect situation is their condition. You're right. But he didn't even deal with the other. But it's interesting enough that he didn't even have to talk to them at all because the law required that both of them. They weren't even honest. Yeah. Bring the woman, but not the man, which some have speculated it was probably one of the leaders, which you never know. It could have been. They certainly know the situation. Isn't that pathetic? But you're right. They themselves. So then he can rightly say, number one, because he's the Son of God, he can do that rightly. And he knows their heart and he knows their condition besides the sin they're committing there. He says, you who has the sin, cast the first stone. Because he already gives the order that the law says. Go ahead.
Those who are sinless cast the first stone.
Yeah, the one who's sinless, who has sinless to cast the first stone. And yet at the same time, when he uses the analogy of the stone, he's acknowledging the law required that. And here you are bringing her to me, and you're right. Then he transitions, it transcends that to the salvation story. But here's the important thing. Let's read that. John 8 and 28. Sister Paula, will you read that for us? John 8 and verse 28. Sorry. But I talked too long. Didn't let you read. Not John 8. Yeah, John 8:28. I was looking at 12. Yeah, 8:20. Yeah, 8:28. Yes, ma'am.
So Jesus said to them, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me.
All right. When he gets with that section there, he's moving in, and that's the continuation of the thought. He obviously alludes to his death. And the key thing is when you lift me up, right, then you're going to know me. You're going to know of me. You're going to know who I am. Remember the centurion in Mark, the 14th chapter, that was standing at the cross of Jesus, and we mentioned that last week. What did he say as Jesus died? Truly, he was the Son of God. This is a pagan man. And there's enough information standing before him. I would argue for you men who will be doing the 7 sayings of Jesus, and besides those, I'm sure if he was there in the garrison and other things at the trial, maybe. But I know this much, because we can say this for sure. That centurion could base his information, he could say this honestly, based on the 7 things that Jesus said on the cross. Remember that, guys. Kind of help you out there. The 7 things that Jesus said was the evidence that this centurion needed to say what he said. Okay. John chapter 6, verse 45. Now we're in the context of the 5,000 who's come back the second day to say, hey, feed us some more. John 6 and 26, that's what Jesus says. You only come back because I fed you and your belly is empty again and you're ready for me to fill it back up. Paraphrasing here, you know. And so he goes into the story of the bread of life, and they get sickened by it because they're thinking carnally and, you know, thinking about cannibalism and all of that. We know by the time we get to the end in John 6 and verse 66, they walk away from him, not to follow him anymore. So he loses this number. We know there'll be others. Later on in the 4,000, they will not repeat the same. But let's look at John 6 and verse 45. Right. 6:45. Tammy, would you read that for us? Wow. The reason I chose that one, it's been written. He didn't just say, because I said so, although he could, right? And there are times when he speaks and he obviously exudes authority and they say such. But notice how he references, it's already been said in the law and the prophets. It's been written. And you're going to come to understand this. So it's contained in the words of God, or the Word. We got to learn. You see, really, if you understand the problem sometimes, besides the hesitancy, the intrepidation, because we know there's going to be struggle, we haven't even talked about that, the problems we may have in being a disciple, it's not going to be an easy thing to do. Sometimes we're going to be rejected. Sometimes we might even be violently rejected. It's possible. We certainly are going to endure hatred and envy and strife with others. All right? But with all of that, the thing is our problem is that we're not even starting out learning in order to be disciples. Because remember, we started out with the definition, a disciple's a learner. Remember what I said? You don't read your Bible enough, you're not prepared to be a teacher. You're not prepared because you're not a learner to do the work of the Lord. And more than that, you're not prepared to serve Him. In other words, you are an unworthy, lazy, slothful slave, just like the 1-talent man in Matthew 25. Right? That's what he says in John 6 and verse 45. You've got to learn. Third, you got to love like God. Now, I get it. You know, somebody said, well, preacher, wait a minute. Now, God is love, and that's the nature of His character, and we're going to strive, but we're never going to reach that kind of perfection. And I know that we talk, I understand there's a sense in which we're not going to be like God in that. But let me make it clear. We get the mentality of, and this is our past, because we're imperfect and we're never going to strive to get, we're never going to be perfect, we're always going to hesitate to even try to become. But the Scriptures teach us time and again that we need to. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, 1 Corinthians 11:1. Whoa, Paul's imitating him, and he says, I got to imitate him in as much as he imitates Christ. That's something we got to consider. And the same thing with love. We got to love like God. Let's look at John chapter 15. John chapter 15, verses 9 through 12. John 15, 9 through 12. Sister Angela, would you read that for us, please?
As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love.
See that? Abiding in a love, by necessity of the nature of love. Love, an action word that says, if you keep my commandments, as I said from 1 John 5:3, but likewise the Gospels there in John 15. If we love him, we will keep his commandments, which means that love is connected to the doing parts, right? And therefore, if we love him, we will abide. And likewise, he has loved the Father, so he abides in the Father's will. Therefore, the Father reciprocates, doesn't he, and loves the Son. And so he teaches us by reciprocation because of the acting in accordance to the will that we too will do the same thing. If we're willing to learn as we've learned, learn from him, then we can love like him. You see that? And that's what he's saying there. That's what Jesus is saying of his disciples. And you will love me, and I will love you, because you will repeat the same activities, the same actions that I have performed with my Father. You read John 15, or actually if you want to start at John 14, work your way through John 17, and the picture will be painted clear. John 15 and 16 are the bookmarks, or the centerpiece to that discussion of the love of God. And that love of God is not an impossibility. Not an impossibility. That God has designed it so that I can love him like he loved his Son, like his Son loved him. And it's all reciprocal. All right? So in order to be a disciple, we've got to learn to love like God. Remember what I didn't say, just merely love God. Yes, that's true, and that would be contained in it. But we get very generic and very basic, and we forget that there's an essence to this. If I love God, then I'm going to want to strive to love like God. See the action in that? See the work in that? If I've got to love like God, and I know I'm not anywhere close to that, or I haven't been, I've got to find out how. And that goes back to my learning, right? Go back to learning what he says that loving like him looks like. And that's where John 15, 16, and I'd also include 14 and 17 in the story. Fourth thing, lead others to God. You've got to lead others to God. Now, that gets into the root work, okay, the responsibility we have. Brother Elliot, would you read for us John 17 in verse 26, please? John 17, verse 26. All right. Notice how I stayed in the same area. John's a good place to do this. But notice how he completed my thought a while ago. Actually, God's completed my thought, hasn't he? As Brother Elliott's read. It ain't my thought. It's actually God's thought. That's why I said it. Notice he connected love with keeping the will, doing. And that's what he's talking about in John 17. Not only does he do it, but the disciples must do it, and they will teach others to do it, and that's where love will be founded. So we learn to lead others to God, which is the essence of loving God. Now let's go ask that question again. Am I a disciple? Well, I have to say, do I love others? Do I love them enough to lead them or to teach them? If I hesitate and I don't, then what am I proclaiming? I don't love God. I can say it all I want. And you can say, well, preacher, you don't. No, let's just be honest with ourselves. I don't love God. I don't care that I'm not a debased, immoral creature, because guess that's not the standard, guys. That's not the standard. I don't have to be the murderer or the adulterer. I don't have to be that terrible guy that's mean to everybody. I don't have to be in order to not love God. All I have to do in this context is say I'm a disciple when I am not. All right? Sister Mackenzie, would you read chapter 20, John chapter 20, we're in the book of John, John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31.
Therefore, many other times Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe in Jesus, believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name.
Wow. Now, a lot of people they surface scratch this. Oh, okay, I believe in God. Oh, I believe that Bible's inspired, and therefore I'll have life. No, we understand the comprehensive nature of belief when we delve into that book, and we discover every time he talks about believing, he is going to get into the nuts and the bolts, as we say, and we're going to get down to the very heart of it, and then we discover, oh, I've got to lead others to God. Not only do I live a moral life, and I've got to watch my P's and Q's, but I've got to also care for others. And we hadn't even got into the discussion this evening. Aside from the evangelism, I've got to desire to help others in need. I got a lot of things on my plate. If I really love God, if I really believe, as she read, then there's a lot to that. It ain't going to be enough for me to say, I love God. I obeyed the gospel. I believe that's inspired word. I believe that He died, and anybody that says otherwise, they're wrong. Well, that may be the only courage I'll ever have, if I have that. That's a problem. Notice the four things. I honor God. I learn from God. I honor God because I do the things. Notice how all they lead to doing. If I honor God, I do for Him. I serve Him as a good and faithful servant. I learn from Him. Why? Because He's my master teacher and I'm the disciple. I'm the learner. And I can't know what to do, by the way, unless I look to find out what He wants. And I love like Him. I didn't say love Him, but in order to love Him, in order to really love Him, I will have to love like Him. So I have to learn how He loved. If I learn how God loved, like John 3:16, really, if you develop that, then I will become a disciple. And fourthly, I lead others to God. Now that sometimes is the heart of the matter that we're always going to stop short of. Acts 8:4. Acts 8:4. Ben, what does Acts 8:4 say? You should be very familiar with it. Short passage. They've killed Saul. They have killed Stephen. Saul was in cahoots with them, and now he's already started, as it says in verses 1 through 3, he's gone out and he's got arrest warrants, and he's starting to drag these men and women that are believers into jail. It's going to eventually get worse and bad enough that he's going to go to Damascus. So what does it say in verse 4?
Therefore, those who have been scattered went about preaching the word.
Wow. You would have thought, if you were reading this as some storyline, maybe writing a play or a movie, the next line would be you'd be trying to figure out how he wrote in where they hid, where they went to get away, right? You'd be writing how they would regroup and rethink some things and change some things and so on and so forth, right? You know, it'd be almost like the group of Essenes that went out into the wilderness and hid out, right? The Jewish. And later on, when the destruction of Jerusalem occurred, and understand that with Titus, when he continued the work of his father, Vespasian, he goes into the mountainsides and he goes into the caves because these people are hiding out and burns them out and so on and so forth. Why? Because they went into to hide. We understand why they did, but you see the point. You would imagine these sorts of things. Didn't say that, did it? They did what? Went everywhere preaching. Now, again, they're going to be heading home. We get the technicalities, but the point is, it only encouraged them to do more. Now, certainly they couldn't do it right there because they were being routed. We're not saying you stay put. You know, you may have to use judgment and move on, but you're going to continue the work that you were doing before. You want to know why the church thrived in the first century? That's it. It wasn't miraculous. I know they have miraculous gifts, but that wasn't miraculous. There was no miracle that had to be performed in order to get these people to continue what they'd already been doing. Why did the church spread and grow beyond Jerusalem? Because they went everywhere preaching. All right? That's our job. We want the church to grow here in our community and our place. What's the formula? Well, it's a hard task, but it's simple. Go everywhere preaching. Now, that doesn't mean we have to leave town, but you know what I mean. We go out preaching, right? That's the point. One more verse. John chapter 8, verse 31 and 32. We're familiar with 32 because it says what? What's John 8:32 say? Yeah, you might have a little plaque of that. You probably heard that said. That you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But we get a little bit of the context because we're not done with John 8. Remember, we used it a while ago in the discussion in 45. No, not 45, 28. Look at 31 also. Jeannie, 31 and 32.
And Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."
See what the first, sometimes we run right, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And maybe we were generic in our understanding of that. Maybe we have some specifics. But notice what 31 says. Would you repeat that again?
If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed.
If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. His word says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. His word says, go everywhere and preach. His word says a host of other things, of course, in regards to our relationship with Him. It says to learn to love like Him, to learn who He is, to honor Him, and that would be done in praising Him through our actions, through our deeds. And the Word says to lead others to Christ. Unless we're full of His Word, unless we are desirous to lead others, then we're just simply blind followers following the blind teacher. Matthew chapter 15, 14, he talks about when the blind lead the blind, then they both fall into the ditch, or the pit, as I like it, because that's really what the word would literally, we think of a ditch as some little short, shallow thing. You don't get hurt maybe you get a little dinged up. Fall into a pit. It's a different matter, isn't it? They both fall into the pit. It's devastating to them. It's a finality, you see. They both lose. They're condemned. And so what we learn is that we've got to make sure that we are doing these things to be disciples. Honoring God, learning from God, loving like God, and leading others to God. And we work all of those together. And sometimes we are imperfect with them, but we strive. So not just any teacher will do. Jesus will be the only one. Not only that, but my way can't work. It's got to be His way or no way, right? And we're not called to be passive followers. Followers that just kind of, you see those people, sometimes protesters and all that. It's a farce. Anybody can follow hundreds or thousands, can't you? But when the trouble really comes, you'll see how that crowd disperses, right? It's always inevitable. You'll see who will stand, who is, we would say, principled or whatever, whoever believes in their cause. That's the point. They're the only ones going to stand. But you've seen it, riots and mobs. Do they last if there's a real opposition? No. But that doesn't mean somebody didn't make it. That just means the mob never makes it. And that's the real issue, because we've got a mob mentality when it comes. You know why Christianity is so easy in this country? Because it's so easy in this country. That's why it's so easy. And it has been in the years gone by. It may change. Why was it so popular in the 80s as I was coming of age to be a Christian? Because the whole fervor of the Christian right and the fighting against the political fallout of the hippie generation and all the social engineering generation and everything. And all of a sudden people are fed up and they're just wanting to raise their families and they see the problems. And now you get a little bit of morality and mix, and now Christianity is popular. Do you know that's when all the mottos and the sayings come about? WWJD. Yeah, what would Jesus do? You've seen the wristbands back in the day, right? You see my point? Those are just cute sayings because it was easy, it was comfortable. Calling yourself a Christian was a popular thing. Even when I was in high school. It didn't matter if you were a moral creature or not, just you were a Christian, It was popular. There wasn't nothing that was unpopular about it. And those things can change. We got to be active to make our call election sure. 2 Peter chapter 1, 10 and 11, he says, make sure your call is an election sure. If you don't, you're not a disciple. So I ask again as I close out, are you a disciple? Maybe, just maybe, we have to say, sometimes, yeah. Too many times, no. Maybe I've been not for a long while. Maybe I need to rethink this, and maybe I've done some things that are defined as disciple work, and that's good. Don't get me wrong. Don't change that. But there's plenty of other things I'm not doing. So Lord willing, next week, we're going to start putting it to action. I've got some ideals, some thoughts. That's going to be the practical of the practical. All right? Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes?
Something I was thinking about as we were talking about this, like, it reminded me of the story of Joseph with the 7 years of good.
Yeah.
The cows, and then, we might come upon the 7 years of famine where we will be tested.
Yeah.
Like Job was tested, he
Mhm.
he was protected by God, and then he was tested.
Yeah. Yeah.
How will we stand?
And God may be patient enough to give us that time to see if we're going to change, because we may not be who we should be, and He's working on getting us to change, but He's patient enough to give us 3 years, 7 years, or whatever, and, okay, come on, Chuck, are you going to do anything? Are you going to do anything about this? I'm only going to wait so long. And at some point, His waiting ceases. And hopefully it's not the very end in which He returns, or His Son returns. All right, any other questions or comments? All right. So that's what a discipleship, being a disciple, is all about, and it's scary. It's challenging. And sometimes it's very painful to put into practice. But it can make a good habit if we're really working hard at it, and it's necessary. It's not an option. All right? Enough people have been too timid about that subject, and we need to make sure that we really plow that hard and make sure that we understand. Okay? All right. We're going to have a dismissal prayer. David, you lead us in prayer as we close out this evening.
Father in heaven, we all feel inferior, slack. Help us to be more what we're supposed to be instead of want to be. We know that it takes effort to do anything good, well. Help us to be that way. If we were to be arrested for a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict us? Most certainly not. Help us to be what we're supposed to be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.